Welcome to Afterwards. I'm Toby Harnden of the Sunday Times of London, and with me today is Kwasi Kwarteng, a Conservative MP who's born in London of Ghanaian parents, and he's here to discuss his superb new book, War and Gold, a 500-year history of empires, adventures and debt. It's received rave reviews already. My own paper described it as enormously readable and an entertaining history which turns the past 500 years into a rollicking narrative. So great to have you here.
Very good to be here. Thank you.
Now, rollicking narrative is not usually the description you get for politicians' books. And this strikes me as not really a politician's book. This isn't designed to sort of get you further up the greasy pole.
No.
Why did you write it?
Well, I've always been interested in history. That was what my major was in. I've also got a doctorate in history. And I think that when we look at what happened in 2008, the financial crisis, huge amounts of debate, loads of books, but they all looked at very short-term perspective, through a short-term perspective. They were looking at the banks, they were looking at maybe hedge funds, they were looking at CDOs and credit derivatives. But I thought, hang on, let's take a step back and actually try and understand something about the global financial system, something about the currencies that we have, the dollar, sterling, and also the nature of gold as well, because one of the features of this book is to remind people that we, for 400 years, for 150 years, of the 500-year period, we had a gold-backed currency.
Yeah.
And it was only in 1971 when Richard Nixon famously went off gold. He shut the gold window.
Now tell me about that. One of the things I love about this is you have an eye for the dramatic moments.
That's right.
And I mean, it's about, an ostensibly sort of dry subject, sort of money.
Sure.
But tell me about that moment in 1971 when the TV programme was interrupted.
Well, there are key moments in any history, in any historical narrative. There are always going to be key moments when people just step back and think, oh my God, this is what's happening. And 1971, it was August the 15th, I think, on a Sunday, was very much one of those moments when Richard Nixon essentially appeared on national television halfway through Bonanza, which is this great cowboy show. It's probably not really my time, but maybe viewers will remember that show. And he interrupted the show to say, we're not going to allow the dollar to be converted into gold anymore. And this, in many ways, was one of the most significant events, the most significant things to have happened in the history of money. And it was a very decisive moment where essentially he shut the gold window, that's what the term was, where people could not simply come into Fort Knox, metaphorically, and say, here, at $100, I want to get the gold value. And that was as a consequence of the big, bad problems that the American government, the federal government, had got into with its debt. They were trying to fight the Vietnam War and also pay for the Great Society. And it just didn't work out. There was a huge, there was a deficit, there was a trade deficit. And people like the French and bad people like the Brits were coming to change dollars into gold. And so Richard Nixon decided to stop that. Interestingly enough, the federal chairman at the time, the head of the Federal Reserve, Arthur Burns, was very skeptical about that. I mean, he was an old school kind of balanced budget conservative guy. And he was very wary of actually stopping decoupling the dollar from gold in that way. And
another key moment, dramatic moment, is Lloyd George in the House of Commons in 1914.
That's
another
right.
Big year.
We see the great thing about British public finance for the 100 years before the First World War, before 1914, was essentially they ran balanced budgets. I mean, it's difficult to imagine that now, but the whole of the Victorian era and the 19th century, and these guys with top hats.
And a stable interest rate.
Very stable interest rates, very stable fiscal policy. And what happened in the First World War, and this is one of the key moments of the book, was that all of that just went to pieces. So in order to defeat the Kaiser, in order to defeat Germany, the British Parliament essentially had to vote through massive spending. And he stands up and says, this is an extraordinary thing that we've done. We're going to now borrow billions of sterling, whereas generally it had been hundreds of millions, the budget, up to that point. But they borrowed huge amounts. The national debt went up 10 times, if you can imagine, more than 10 times. So from about 700 million sterling to over 11 billion. And the House of Commons just nodded it through because they would do whatever it took to defeat Germany. That was the attitude.
And obviously a thread right the way through here and in the title is this sort of push-pull effect of war.
Absolutely right.
And money. And you contemplated calling the book Order and Chaos.
Order and Chaos, that's right. I mean, I'll tell you, order, I think, is represented by the gold standard or by a commodity standard where you can see that this is how much my dollar or my pound is worth, and it's linked to some sort of external value, a commodity, for example. Chaos, and one of the arguments I put forward in the book is that we're in a period of relative chaos at the moment, is when you don't have any kind of mooring to commodities. You have what is called fiat money, paper money, and essentially you're just at the mercy of the printing press. You can just keep printing money. And there is a strand of opinion, certainly in this country, probably more than any other, which says that that was a mistake. We should get back to the gold standard. It's associated with people like Ron Paul and people like that. But my this isn't a polemic. I'm not trying to write a really good narrative to explain how we got to where we are. But I think there is some force in the argument that hang on, we need something more structured than just the ability of governments to print money.
Yeah, I mean the quotes from Ron Paul and his co-author in, I think, 1981,
That's
saying
right.
the 10-year experiment with paper money has failed.
That's right.
And I mean, that is an argument that is very, very resonant here. I mean, there was a big following for Ron Paul in 2008, 2012. His son, Senator Rand Paul, is probably going to run for president in 2016. I mean, do you think we should return to the gold standard? Could we?
Well, there's a different factor in terms of how we could. I'll talk about that initially. The only way we can get back to the gold standard, I mentioned that in this book, is for the Chinese, essentially, to decide unilaterally. They could reinstitute the gold standard tomorrow. They could say, right, a yuan or a renminbi is going to equal X amount of gold. And they've got enough reserves to back that. The only problem for them is that they run an export model. So if they did that, the yuan would become a very, very strong currency, which would be complete reverse of their export-led growth policy, where they want to keep the value of the yuan low so that their exports are cheap and we can buy them, essentially. So that would be a complete reversal. But in terms of actually introducing a gold standard, they can do it because they've got the reserves. And one of the points I make about the gold standard is that if you look at the 19th century, it was Britain who largely sort of guaranteed it. And Britain was running great export surpluses. I mean, Britain was the manufacturer of the world. British goods were flooding, essentially, global markets, not least in America, in South America, and the reserves that Britain acquired through its export trade meant that they could keep a gold standard. Now, the British themselves, we never really had that much gold, but everyone sort of relied on the stability and the export strength of Britain. Similarly, in the 20th century, for much of the 20th century, the United States ran current account surpluses. I mean, it's unbelievable to think that. Yeah. But really, until 1970, from about 1900 to 1970, the US was exporting more than it was importing. So it was building up reserves. It was building up gold and other foreign currency reserves. And they really, the United States, guaranteed the gold standard, certainly after the First World War. And of course, the whole Bretton Woods settlement was based on this talismanic value of the dollar at $35 an ounce. That was how an ounce of gold. Yeah. That was the relationship, and that lasted from 1944 to 1971, as we were talking about earlier.
So it sounds like it wouldn't. You don't anticipate the Chinese doing this. It wouldn't be in their interest.
They wouldn't. I mean, given where they've come from in the last 25 years, they've deliberately forced their currency to be much lower, and I outlined that in the book. Yeah. I mean, if you look at 1980, I think it was something that the yuan was 1.5 yuan to a dollar. Yeah. And then over 20 years, it went down as low as about 8.5. Yeah. And now it's sort of 6.5, that sort of thing. But they deliberately had a very cheap money, or rather low, they wanted low value for their currency so that they could drive exports. So you're right to suggest that if they went to gold, that would be a complete reversal of what they've been doing, of how they've been building their economy through this export growth.
So are you arguing that a return to the gold standard will be impractical?
I think it's impractical. Yeah. I think it's impractical. But what I am saying is that the current system is very vulnerable. Right. And in a way explains what happened in 2008. Yeah. And I talk about that quite fully. I mean, I mentioned the fact that many economists actually predicted that this would happen when you have a system where you've just got a fiat currency, banks essentially are just pushing enter and printing money. Yeah. You're going to get a very vulnerable and unstable system, and I think that's something that we have to consider.
Now, what about the effect of war on 2008? Because obviously 9/11, 7 years earlier.
That's right.
But your argument is that it wasn't just about 9/11 and war spending. It was about something much bigger. Than that.
It was a very it wasn't that complicated. But if you remember, I mean, I was on the trading floor in 2001, and the first thing that happened,
you worked for JP
I was at
Morgan.
JP Morgan. That's right. I hope that's not a swear word here in this context. But yeah, I was a